So we've been doing a series on the story of the Bible, right? And how the story of the Bible is this incredible thing where God reveals himself to us through his interaction with us. So the only way that we begin to know God is because we see how he interacts with people. And so what we've been doing is we've had Lois tell us her story. It's kind of a mirror of what God is doing in the Bible. And so she shared with us a lot of different things. I don't think I can even begin to recap all of it, but you were a missionary child in Sri Lanka and other places as well. And then you came back, and it was a big culture shock, right? That was a big thing. And then then last week you talked a little bit about that culture shock. Am I correct? Boarding school, yeah. Because you got in trouble at boarding school, yeah. So Lois she looks nice and sweet, but she said of herself that she's a rebel at heart. So we're excited to hear the last installment in our story for this series. So, yeah.
In those days, Tacoma had a sour paper mill smell, and to this day, if I catch a whiff, it brings me back to the days of morning sickness and gray skies. To escape, my husband and I visited my sister and brother-in-law in North Thailand. Pregnant or not, I wasn't going to miss out on that adventure. Jason fell in love with Asia. In his excitement, he loaded me on the back of a motorcycle, and off we went to see some jungle ruins and elephants, wild elephants. When one of the elephants took a step towards us, he throttled the engine, and his pregnant wife fell off the back of the motorcycle. Back in Washington, not much excitement except having that baby, and after that, Mount St. Helens exploded. So when Jason was offered a job in Bangkok, we were ready to go. Our second baby was born in Thailand, and guess what? I had a maid to take care of my babies. Well, I got to teach English and explore Bangkok. Then the United Nations hired us to assist Cambodian refugees on the Thai border. Nearly 50 refugee organizations were working on the border, resulting in a crazy kind of frontier town vibe. We'd wake up to the sound of shell explosions in the east, and we knew that our refugees needed help. I won't lie, being needed in a war zone is addicting. In the morning, we'd drive 15 kilometers on a dirt road, cross the border, work in the refugee camp, and in the evening, return to our splendid little life in Thailand. We usually rode in the pickup truck. However, I owned a smallish Suzuki motorcycle myself. So if I wanted to leave work early, I'd take the motorcycle. One afternoon, I left camp around 3. I noticed dark monsoon clouds, so I hurried along, trying to avoid the ruts and potholes. It started to rain, and the path got muddy and slippery. I turned sharply left to avoid a rock, and that's when I lost control of the motorcycle and spilled myself into the mud. Far from anywhere, I had to figure this one out on my own. The handlebars were out of alignment. I was drenched and bruised, but I got back on and gingerly made my way back home. So there was the fun of parenting and these tropical beach vacations and beautiful ordinary events on one hand, happening right beside the tragedies of children not recovering from malaria and people dying from shrapnel wounds on the other hand. I took the pleasures for granted and blamed God for the miseries of war. When those jobs ended, so did our sense of purpose. We settled in California, got jobs, and tried to grow up. We both worked for a TV ministry, but my commitment wasn't there. By the time we moved to Washington State again, I was done with the pretense of being Christian. I functioned okay. By that time, I had a degree in marriage and family therapy, which is ironic because our marriage was actually floundering. Not surprising, given my level of selfishness. I continued to make poor choices that hurt me and my family. I felt unhappy, read dozens of self-help books, yet nothing was actually fixing me. Years go by. My disregard of God continued. There were endless diversions and enjoyments, work, cruises, games, camping, skiing. Yet nothing was bringing lasting satisfaction. When my daughters left home, I felt particularly empty and discouraged about my wasted life. Then the precious grandbabies came along, and I temporarily felt okay. If you had seen me, you wouldn't have known that my heart was sad and empty. About 4 years ago, I wrote this dark entry in my journal. Cuss words have been edited out. I'm so bleep bleep tired of hating myself. I'm tired of being cynical. I'm tired of dreading the future, and I'm tired of feeling this worry and regret and emptiness. That's when something nudged me to read a book called The Great Controversy. I also read a book about ancient Catholic saints who really loved God. Every morning, I'd take my cup of coffee to the craft room and read. Over time, I felt a flutter of hope. I asked my friend Vicky, "So how does one start loving God?" She paused and answered, "Well, I suppose if you spend time talking to him, you'd start loving him." That made perfect sense. Now, in addition to reading, I decided to talk to God, to actually pray. Yikes. In order to stay focused, I wrote prayers. Here's an early snippet. "Oh, hello, God, this is Lois. I'm confused. Am I supposed to love you, or is it fear and respect you want? Please don't be insulted by my questions, God. I'm being sincere. Bye, I'm listening." Days went by, and the prayers became less awkward. Yet, I still couldn't admit I was Christian. See, I had this resistance, a big wall of embarrassment. I disliked Christian cliches, and I avoided trite expressions. But greater than my stubbornness and resistance was my yearning for the love of God. I decided to let myself be influenced by God. This was a big deal. Remember the missionary kid who always resisted authority? Yep, me, agreeing to be influenced. Was there a dramatic moment of surrender and commitment? No. No bright lights or audible voices either. But it happened. I came to know a reality beyond the world we see and touch. I began to experience the love of God in my heart. These days, I feel joyful and content. Not always, but so much more than before. I'm not nearly as stubborn as I used to be either. I've been telling you my story because I want you to know the reason I'm a Christian. I found out that God is loving, and I've stopped resisting. I finally caved in to love.
Can we just give Lois a big hand for sharing her story? Wow, yeah, it's so powerful. We were talking about this just before we came out to the service and how Lois could tell her story for like another month or two, and we would totally be fine with that. So thank you so much, Lois. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it's so powerful how God can change our hearts. I love how you made that distinction at the end. A stubborn person didn't want to submit to authority, and yet this God who lovingly and tenderly sort of softens your heart over. It's just incredible what God can do. And unfortunately, we're talking about a people who didn't let that happen. We've been going through the story of the Bible, and we've been talking. Some of you have probably seen this. I'm just going to warn you, I'm going to nerd out like monumentally today. I love history, and I love this story of the Bible that we're going over. So it's just kind of bad because you're probably going to get too much. Can you all see this? Some of you may have a little bit of trouble. We've been talking about this people, this nation that God chooses, right? He chooses them and says, "I want to begin to heal the world and restore humanity through you." So the story from the beginning is just simply God creates a world that is beautiful and He gives us authority, but then we're like, yeah, but I don't really trust that you love me because it sounds like you're hiding something from me. And that's what this Garden of Eden, tree of knowledge of good and evil, eating the fruit moment is I don't trust you because it sounds like you're hiding these godlike things from me. And so I don't trust you, and I don't think you have the best of intentions for me. And of course, that turned into this rapid moral decline where we just kind of surrendered to selfishness, because if God isn't looking out for our best interest, the only person who is me. And so I'm going to do whatever I feel like. I'm going to do whatever I need to do. I'm going to kill or be killed. I'm going to take or it will be taken from me. I'm going to do all of those things. So we have these two problems that arise where we don't trust God and we're surrendered to ourselves. And it just doesn't go well. Moral decline happens like crazy. God finally has this reset button. And we get to this story of this guy named Abraham. And God says to him, hey, listen, I'm going to choose you. And I'm going to make you a great nation. And I'm going to bless the entire world through you. I'm going to bless you so that you might be a blessing to the entire world. That's what he says. Abraham, it's like, cool, me and my 18 children. No, me and my childless wife. How is that going to happen? And yet God does all these miracles, and their family expands and grows, but then they find themselves in Egypt in slavery. And then there's this incredible story where it seems like it's all over, and yet God pulls them out of there and delivers them and brings them out. And then he does all of these incredible miracles, and he says, I don't only have you as a people, but I have a place I want to take you to. I have this promised land that I'm going to take you to. And so he says, well, let's go. And they get to the edge of it, and they're like, yeah, but there's a bunch of people in there that are giants, and they're terrifying, and there's lots of them, and we're terrified of that. We don't think you can do it. And so they wander around for 40 years. And just before this, and in their 40 years of wandering, God takes the time to say, hey, you don't know how to love me. You don't know how to love each other. I'm going to teach you how. And then by submitting to my laws and by learning to trust me, you will be a different people in this world. Whereas the nations around you are sacrificing their own children to other gods so that they can they can get a change in their fortune. This guy named Moloch, they can get a change in their fortune so their lives will be better at the cost of their child's life. Whereas they're doing that, and there's rampant injustice, and there's just awful inequality, all this stuff all around you. You are going to be the different people in the midst of a sea of evil. That's what you're going to be. And so finally they come back to the edge of the promised land. God says, okay, let's go in. They go in under this guy named Joshua, and they do so well. They have all these conquests, and they manage to take out all of these nations that were just straight up evil. They take them out, but then there's some that are left over. And over time, those nations begin to have an influence on these people. And they begin to become less and less of the distinct people they were supposed to be, and more like the people around them. That's the book of Judges, and it's an awful book that ends with awful stories, ends with a civil war in Israel. But then we get to these moments. This is where we were last week about these kings that rise up. This guy named Saul, and they do well, the Israelites under Saul. They do well, except that he starts to, instead of seeing it as God's kingdom, he starts to fear that he's going to lose his kingdom in different circumstances. And when he fears that he's going to lose it, he starts to take control of it. And over time, he becomes paranoid and terrified that someone's going to steal his kingdom from him, because there was someone that was going to take his kingdom from him. So the paranoia was maybe a little bit justified. But he's terrified because he doesn't trust God anymore. He's just worried about him. So this guy named David is risen up, and he comes into this kingship. And when he finally gets to be king, this is where we ended last week. When he finally gets to be king, Israel reaches a peak that it had never gotten to before, right? Israel is finally at this place where they are a people starting, and their leader is like surrendered to God. Even though he's got some mistakes, he's surrendered to God. He's doing well. Maybe the promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, maybe it could come true. Maybe. We're right on the edge of that. And so this is where we're going to start today. We're going to start in the book of Kings. It's actually one book, not two. Just like Chronicles isn't. The only reason it's separated is because of scroll length. Just a fun fact. But we're gonna start in the book of Kings. We're going to start in the book of 1 Kings. And where we start is with this guy named Solomon. Solomon, I'm just going to tell you something. So my name is Jesse David Churchill. It's my full name. And so my dad's middle name was Jesse, and so they took his middle name, made it my first name. And so, and then it just so happens that Jesse was the father of David in the Bible, right? So my wife and I have committed, she's not here today, so I get to say this. We've committed to naming our son, to take my middle name and name him David, and then his middle name is going to be Solomon, so David Solomon. And then our grandson will be named Solomon Rehoboam. And then our great-grandson will be named Rehoboam, and then who's after Rehoboam? Anyways, so that's the way it's going to go for the rest of this, down the generations. So David has this son named Solomon. And Solomon is this guy who starts off so well. It's incredible. It's crazy. So Solomon is David's son. He's the son through this woman that David had an affair with and then killed her husband. It's a rough story. Anyways, Solomon is the king now. And he becomes king, and he starts off, and all of a sudden we come to this story where God just shows up to Solomon. He shows up to Solomon twice. And the first time he shows up to Solomon, he says, hey, I will give you whatever you ask for. And Solomon thinks for a while, and he says, okay, I want wisdom to be able to run this nation as it should be. And God goes, whoa, okay, awesome. You didn't ask for wealth. You didn't ask for any of these other things. I'm definitely going to give you wisdom. And we see this in 1 Kings chapter 3, because he asked for wisdom, and then in the second half of 1 Kings chapter 3, it says, it talks about the story where these two women come to Solomon, and they have a dispute. And the problem is that these two women are both single. They were sleeping in the same bed. They both had children that were their own. And one of them rolled over and accidentally suffocated her child. So what she did was she took her child and put it where the other child was, and took the other child that was alive and took it for herself. And when the other mom woke up in the morning, she's like, this isn't my kid. And so now they have a dispute. And they didn't have DNA back then, so now you have a problem. And so they come to Solomon, and here's our problem. And Solomon says, okay, why don't you take the kid, bring a sword, and we're going to cut the baby in half, and we're going to give it both halves to the moms. That's not wise, Solomon. That's a dumb thing to do. Except that the one mom who lost her baby is like, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And the mom who didn't, yeah, because that's awesome. Yeah, you're a great person. You're going to take good care of that baby when you have it. The other mom is like, no. Let her have it as long as the child can live. And Solomon says, she's the mother. Only a mother would have that kind of love for her child. And so this story goes all over the kingdom. Like these types of judgments and these things that he does go all over the kingdom. And everyone's like in awe of him. In 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 28, we see this. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered. And they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Right? Solomon already has this incredible reputation that he is a man who has justice and he's wise. And it goes on, and Solomon, he gets super blessed. In chapter 4, it talks all about how his kingdom stretched all the way to the Euphrates River. So this is my map, okay? I like maps. I like history. This is my nerd place. This is a later. We're going to get to this in a second. But the kingdom of Israel was right here. And Solomon stretched it all the way out up to here. This is not to scale, but all the way out up to here. And there was other nations all around here that he subjugated and made vassals of Israel. Israel was huge. Like the reputation of Israel was spreading all over the world. And he builds this temple. This is the big thing that Solomon does. Because back in the Old Testament, we're in the Old Testament, back in Exodus, there's this story of where they build a temporary home for God, a tent. And it's this place where God can live among his people, just like he lived among his people back in Eden. Except this time they're going to make it a permanent place. This is going to be big. It's going to be amazing. They've been waiting for hundreds of years for this. Even after they got to the land, they waited like a couple hundred years before they built this thing. And so Solomon starts to build it. And it's this grand, glorious thing. He builds a palace for himself, for the kings that will come after him. And he does all of these incredible things. And it gets super exciting because we have this moment where God's purpose is starting to come to fruition. Remember? He said, I'm going to bless this nation so that it can be a blessing to the entire world. And Israel's reputation has now exceeded its boundaries. Now its influence is over all of these nations around them. And it's looking like this is going to start. And it even says at some point in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 20, it says, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand of the sea. Remember what God promised Abraham? I'm going to make your descendants like the stars of the sky. Now it's like, wow, this is starting to come true. This whole promise, this blessing that we're going to be to the rest of the nations around us is coming true, and now we have a king who's going to help us make it come true. And then the Lord appears to Solomon again. He builds the temple. And in chapter 9, this is the second time that God appears to Solomon. And he shows up, 1 Kings chapter 9, and this is what he says to him. I'm going to read through this fast. As soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, and as he appeared to him at Gibeon. That's the first time he appeared to him. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house that you have built by putting my name there forever, meaning he's going to live there. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you will walk before me as your David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne in Israel. We have the first caveat. If you surrender to me, and let me be king over you, even though you're king, it will go well for you. But if you turn aside from following me, this is verse 6, but if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. And Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples, meaning that will be a lesson to all people. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? And then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt and laid hold on other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought disaster on them. And I know it sounds harsh, because you're like, why would the Lord bring disaster on people? But this is what's at stake, and we have to remember this. This nation is either going to be the nation that changes the world, or it's not. Or the world just goes the way of the world. Does that make sense? This nation is either going to change everything or the world is just going to fall apart. That's what's at stake here. And so when God says this, he's like, you're either going to be different or you're going to be just like everybody else, and I am literally trying to restore everybody out of all of the brokenness that they're in. So don't become broken like them. And that's what he says to Solomon. He lays it out, and there's a reason that I read this, because the rest of our story is going to be defined by this command that God gives, or this outline that God gives to Solomon. So God lays out the warning, and everything is going well. But just remember who's responsible for this. That's what God is saying. Just remember who's responsible for this. If you lose your trust in me and start trusting in other things, if you aren't surrendered to my will and you surrender to other gods, it won't go well for you. In the rest of the chapter, we find out something bittersweet, because Solomon has built a temple and he's built a palace, but he's done it with slave labor, which is ironic because just a few generations ago, Israel were slaves in Egypt. So that's the first kind of hint of something's wrong here. And then it goes on, but we still see the greatness of Solomon. In chapter 10, this queen from this kingdom called Sheba, it was probably modern-day Yemen, this queen of Sheba comes to visit him. His reputation is huge. And this part of the story is in the story because it shows just how great Solomon had become, because she comes and she's super impressed by him. He gives her whatever she asks for. She brings gifts. She's incredibly impressed by his wisdom. And that's awesome if you're Solomon. Like, look at all these people that are coming to see you. But then we come to this in 1 Kings 10, verses 14, and we see the glory of Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 14, now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year, was 666 talents of gold. Some of you will recognize that number. And yes, it does correlate. Because that whole beast power thing is, what if it's about who's our king? What if it's about who we're letting be in charge of our life? Because there's a beast in all of us. Okay, anyways, I'm going to get into that another time. Now, the weight of gold. So now, this is specific. All the other numbers that you'll see in this chapter are all round numbers. This one's the only specific one like this. But then also, what's interesting is the sheer amount, 666 talents, comes out to 25 tons of gold. Isn't that insane? 25 tons of gold. Verse 18. Then the king made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. Verse 21, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. Verse 23, thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his mind. Every one of them brought his presents, articles of silver and gold, and garments of myrrh, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. Verse 27, this is crazy. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone. You're just throwing silver around. Cool. Made cedar as plentiful as sycamore. And we see this incredible wealth that Solomon built up. It's incredible. And you look at this and you think, wow, Israel is finally reaching its potential. Everyone is flocking to this place to be influenced by the people of God. But there's always a but. 1 Kings 11. And this is where everything goes wrong. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, the Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations, concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart from your God, or to other gods. Solomon clung to these in love. This is nuts. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. I'm not going to talk about the logistics of that. But this is the saddest sentence right here. And his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after the Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. And then we come to something really sad. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Molech is the god that you sacrifice your children to. It doesn't sound like Solomon sacrificed his children, but he built an altar where you could worship and do it. And so he did with all his foreign wives in verse 8, who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods. And it's so sad because you go from this place where everything is on the rise. Israel is finally starting to take its place that God had promised to them. And Solomon is the man who gets them there. But when he had reached this level of power, he started to trust not in God, but he started to trust in his power, in his reputation, in his riches, in his wives. And he started to trust in everything but God, because now he doesn't need God anymore. Isn't it sad how so often when we get the things that we'd like, we turn away? A professor of mine said it this way: so often we use the gifts that God gives us to then declare our independence from Him. So often we use the gifts that God gives us to then declare our independence from Him. I have a savings account that God blessed me with, but now I don't need to trust God anymore. I have a wife, or I have a good job, and I have a nice life, and that God gave me. Now I don't need to trust God anymore. And this is just a whole other level, because there's a whole nation that depends on Solomon and is influenced by him. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 17, I'm just going to run through this. You see this, that this was warned. Deuteronomy chapter 17, Moses lays this out to them. This is what your king must not do. Must not acquire many horses for himself. Must not go back to Egypt. It's literally said that he got horses from Egypt. Since the Lord said, you shall never return that way again. Next verse, he says, and you shall not require many wives for himself. Whoops. Then your heart will turn away, and he should not acquire excess silver and gold. And it says that he should not put himself above the other people in his kingdom, and all of this stuff. And yet he enslaves people, and he takes things from Egypt, and he acquires wealth, and he acquires gold, and he acquires wives. And now look at where he is. Can't say you didn't get warned. And this starts the greatest tragedy that you could see in this story, because what happens is Israel is over here. Right? Israel is this beautiful nation that's full. This is later. Israel is this whole thing, the red and the green. But Solomon has a son Solomon's son is named Rehoboam, okay? And Rehoboam is, nope, that's the wrong one. Solomon's name is Rehoboam. And Rehoboam becomes king after Solomon dies. And when Rehoboam becomes king, the people of Israel show up and they say, hey, your father was actually really rough on us. He was really tough. He enslaved, like he put so much weight on us. Would you lighten the load? And Rehoboam goes, okay, give me a couple days. And he goes and he talks to the elders, the people who advised his father. And he says, hey, what should I do? And they go, you should do it. Lighten their load, because if you do it, they will serve you happily forever. Rehoboam goes, cool, I want that. Let me go ask my friends what to do. And he goes and he asks his friends. And his friends don't really have the wisdom. They are looking to consolidate power. And they say, no. Tell them that you're a bigger man than your father will ever be. I'm going to be twice as hard on you as he was. So that goes well. And there's this guy named Jeroboam. And Jeroboam was this guy who, during the reign of Solomon, is told that he is going to be the king of a divided Israel. And Solomon hears about it and tries to kill him. Jeroboam runs away to Egypt to hide, which kind of sounds like when Herod tried to kill Jesus and his family. There's a lot more stuff in the Bible that lines up when you look at it, the whole story. It's crazy. So Jeroboam runs away to Egypt. He comes back. He's there when Rehoboam is like, nah, I'm going to be twice the man my father was. And so they're all like, no, we don't need this. The 10 tribes of Israel are like, we don't need this. We're going to make Jeroboam our king. And the only thing left to Rehoboam is this spot down here. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Those are the only tribes left to him. The kingdom is split. We went from a united kingdom ready to change the world to a split kingdom in the matter of a few years. A kingdom that was divided against itself. I mean, it kind of sounds like the church sometimes. We're more focused on infighting than we are on doing what we're supposed to do. Also America. Rehoboam is king, and Jeroboam becomes king. And it gets so sad, because one of the first acts of Jeroboam is to do this. He's like, if the people go to worship in Jerusalem, which is right here, where the temple is, guess what they're going to do? They're going to all defect to Rehoboam's kingdom. So I'm going to do something different. And he builds 2 golden calves, because they're supposed to represent the God of Israel, but 2 golden calves, and places them in 2 cities in Israel, and says, no, you'll worship here. Which is weird, because if you go back to Exodus, there's this moment with a golden calf, and it's not a good moment, okay? But what's crazy is the reason this becomes a problem, and you're going to see this specific thing, Jeroboam's sins. His sins continue through the rest of the nation of Israel, the rest of the history of Israel, because they substituted God for these idols. And these idols were made after cows, which were a symbol of power, something that all the nations around them worship. So yeah, you can call this the God of Israel, but it's really not. Over time, it becomes watered down, becomes very much like the nations around you. So this is not a good thing. And so Jeroboam makes two golden calves, and he goes through and makes them all worship that. Rehoboam, meanwhile, he's over here doing great. If you call 5 years into his reign being attacked by Egypt and having all of his stuff taken from him, yeah, if you call that great, he's doing great. And he has a son named Abijam, okay? And Abijam is just as bad as his father, okay? I'm going to put little X's here. Just as bad as his father, does all the same things, though he does win a victory against Jeroboam. But then after this, there's this guy named Asa. And this is the first king that we see who does something interesting. He starts to turn back to God. He tears down all the altars and all of the religious worship to other gods. He does that, and he institutes all these reforms, and it's good. But then over here in Israel, we're doing great. We got this guy named Nadab, okay? Nadab, and he does great. Does the same stuff as did, and then he gets killed in a coup, so that's awesome. And then we got this guy named Baasha, who was the guy who killed him, and Baasha kills him and all of Jeroboam's descendants. This is like an awesome people of God we got going on here. Kills him and all of Jeroboam's descendants, but he continued in the sins of Jeroboam. He kept the golden calves. He kept people worshiping these other stuff. And he starts building a city that's going to, right around here, which is going to cut off Judah's trade. So guess what Asa does? This man of God, this guy Asa, he's worried because he's not going to have trade. So he goes, I'm going to talk to Syria, this nation up here, and I'm going to pay them off and say, hey, could you attack Israel for me? And it's this sad moment because instead of trusting God, he's trusting in nations and peoples that want to it. These are not people who are like, oh, we love Judah. No, they're about power, and if they can take something from them, they're going to take it from you. So he does that, and Baasha, he ends up getting killed over time, but Asa over here, he gets a disease in his feet. He doesn't trust God. A prophet comes to him and says, hey, you should repent. Doesn't, he just kills him, right? This guy goes from awesome to bad real quick. And the reason I put a dash there is because he starts off good, but then he ends badly. He gets a disease in his feet, doesn't seek God in that. But before Asa dies, Israel has a few fun years. Okay, these are some real fun, these are the great times in Israel. So Elah is the son of Baasha, and he's not great either. Elah becomes king, he's bad. 2 years into his reign, he gets drunk, and one of the guys in his army kills him. Awesome friends he's got around him. And then that guy, Zimri, rules for a grand total of 7 days before the commander of the army, who was at a city, besieging another city somewhere else, hears that Elah died, and he's like, oh, okay, I'm going to be king. So then he goes and he attacks Zimri and kills Zimri after a grand total of 7 days, so that's awesome. But Omri is described as doing more evil than all of the kings before him. More. And he keeps the golden calves. And his son Ahab comes to reign. And most of us have heard of Ahab. Ahab was this awful guy. Go to 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 through 33. And we'll see this right here. 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 19 through 23. And we're going to see just how great, how great Ahab is. If we get there. I'm going to read here. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri began to reign over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him, so his dad outweighed everyone else, and then he does worse. Cool, we're going real well. And if it was a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of the Ethbaal king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal. Meaning he married this woman who literally started to worship Baal in the entirety of the nation. Now Baal worship becomes nationwide. And this isn't great. And that's not fun. And so there's this guy named Elijah who's a prophet, and he shows up and says, hey, you're not following God. There's going to be a famine for a few years. Then after that, there's a showdown between God and Baal. Spoiler alert, God wins that one. But Ahab also ends up killing this Israelite guy named Naboth because Naboth has a vineyard Ahab wants. And so we start to see like the injustice and the terrible people that these people had become and the gods that they were worshiping. And in the meantime, Asa's son Jehoshaphat becomes king. Jehoshaphat's great. I'm not going to go through all of these, I promise. Jehoshaphat becomes king. And he becomes king, and he walks according to God's commands, and over time, he makes an alliance with Ahab against Syria and all this stuff, and then they fight, and Jehoshaphat manages to escape, but Ahab dies. Then his son Ahaziah comes to power, and he's evil, and he serves Baal. Oh man, we're just like, it's just getting better. It's just getting better and better and better. Jehoshaphat's a good guy, though. We're cool with him. It says that he serves God and does all of that. But Ahaziah comes to power, and then his son Joram comes to power, and he's not great either. And then we run into this part in the kingdoms of Israel where they have like the same names, and it's really annoying, okay? Because we run into a Joram of Israel, and then we run into like a Joram of Judah, and that's fun to figure out. But this is where it gets really sad, because stuff just starts to happen, okay? So we get this Joram, and he dies because he is married to, I'm wrong here, he's married to Ahab's daughter. He's married to Ahab's daughter, which means that he's also influenced by all this stuff. And so that doesn't go well. But then his son comes to power, Ahaziah, and he goes to war with Syria, right? He goes to war with Syria over here with his uncle Joram, right? So Ahaziah, this is where I had it wrong. Joram's here. And then Ahaziah is there. And they're both start off good and bad. He goes to war with Joram against Syria. And guess what happens? His uncle Joram gets injured. So they go away from the battle. Ahaziah goes to visit his uncle Joram. Well, guess what happens? While he's visiting, this other guy named Jehu decides to kill both of them. So now both kingdoms don't. And then this woman named Athaliah becomes the queen of Judah, and she's the daughter of Ahab. So now all of the sins of Ahab are in Judah. And she, as the good grandmother that she is, kills all of her royal family, all of her grandkids, so that she can keep power. But then there's one kid named Josiah. I am all out of sorts here. This one kid named, we're going to get there, Joash. And Joash, he repairs the temple, and he does all this stuff because he comes to power at the age of 7, right? They do this against this Queen Athaliah, and there's this crazy story, but then all of a sudden he becomes king, and after he's king, he repairs the temple, and he does all this incredible stuff. But it's all because this guy named Jehoiada, who was the priest at the time. And Jehoiada was the one influencing him to do all this stuff. And as soon as Jehoiada dies, guess what Joash does? He turns away, and he starts following other things. Jehoiada was this great guy who was always looking out for him. Joash ends up killing his son because his son comes and challenges Joash on all that he's doing. These are the kings of Judah that we're in. And then it keeps going, and we get to these kings. We get to a few kings we don't care about over in Israel, and we get to this guy named Amaziah, who does what's right, and he does all of this good stuff in the kingdom. And then we get to this guy named Uzziah, who's really good, but then he gets really powerful. He's a king in Judah. He gets really powerful. When he gets really powerful, he gets really cocky, and he feels real good about himself, so he goes to the temple. He's won a bunch of victories. He's done all this stuff. He goes to the temple, and he wants to offer incense in the temple. It's a priest thing to do, not a king thing to do. Priests are people who they know what to do in relation to God. He's not a priest. So he's like, I'm going to do it anyways. And when he goes to do it, he gets leprosy for the rest of his life. And his son Jotham reigns in his stead. And so we're just really hitting the motherlode of good leaders as time goes on. In Israel, we start to get to this really sad place where this guy named Zechariah starts to rule, and he rules for 6 months before he's killed in a coup. And this guy named Shallum comes up, but he rules for a month before being overthrown. This guy named Menachem, there's a chem there. Menachem continues the sins of Jeroboam. He becomes a subject kingdom of Assyria. There's this new power called Assyria that comes up, and he becomes a subject kingdom of them. While he's king, there's another guy named Pekahiah who's also ruling in Israel. He just kind of set up his own little thing. He ends up killing Menachem. I mean, it's nuts. How do we go from the people who were united and ready to change the world to these people who are literally killing themselves and getting nowhere? How do we go that far that fast? And it's sad because after this guy named Pekah, who takes over this kingdom, he becomes a vassal of Assyria as well. But then this final king named Hoshea, this guy, he's the last king here, Hoshea, he's a vassal of Assyria, meaning that he has to pay tribute. He's technically not really in charge. He's just in charge of his little kingdom, while Assyria is really in charge. He's there, and he rebels, and Assyria doesn't like it very much. So what do? They attack, and they attack Samaria. That's the capital of Israel. They attack Samaria. And after 3 years, they take it. They destroy it. They take all of the people of these 10 tribes of Israel and take them away from the land. And in that empty land that's left, they take people from other nations that they've conquered and they move them in. And I know for a lot of us, we look at that and it's like, okay, that's sad. But think about it as your home. If God promised you, if God promised us this church, this place, this city, and said, this is for you. And then we made it our home for hundreds of years, and yeah, it was imperfect, but this was our home. And all of a sudden the government comes and takes it from us and then puts it in a bunch of people who have the opposite idea of how life should go. It would be a terrible tragedy. It's sad, it's awful. And that happens to Israel. And Assyria comes and takes them. Well, Babylon comes and destroys Assyria over time. And down here in Judah, there's a few more kings, guys like Hezekiah, who is a good king, but he does something dumb. He does something real dumb. Some envoys come from Babylon to see him, and he gives them a tour, shows them all of his stuff, shows them his storehouses filled with treasure. Because that's smart. His son is rough. Actually, I skipped one guy. I just need to go to this guy. There's this guy named Ahaz. Ahaz was Hezekiah's father. Ahaz sacrifices some of his sons in worship to other gods. But then Hezekiah happens, and then his son Manasseh, guess what he does? He reverses everything Hezekiah did and builds all these altars back and does all this stuff. He sacrifices his sons as well. He gets taken into captivity by Assyria before Babylon. So he gets taken into captivity, gets brought back and he's let to be king. And what's crazy is Manasseh has a backwards thing. All of the other kings that are good then turn evil. That's how they go, good and then evil. Manasseh was awful. He sacrificed his own children. He put an idol in the temple of God. Literally that's the biggest sacrilege you could do in the Jewish nation. And yet when he comes back from captivity, he's a changed man. He rebuilds the altars of God, tears down all the other ones. He has a change of heart. But it's not soon enough, because then his son Ammon, for 2 years, he reigns for 2 years, undoes all of it. Then his son Josiah becomes the king and reverses the reversals of the reversals and goes back to God, and he's good, but then he does something dumb. And we're almost to the end of this part. He does something dumb. The king of Egypt is going to fight Babylon while allied with Assyria. That happens, okay? He's going, and the king of Egypt is coming past Judah, and he's like, I don't want to fight you. And Josiah's like, I do want to fight you. And he goes and he fights him and he dies. So Egypt goes and he fights this battle called the Battle of Megiddo, gets defeated, but while Necho, the king of Egypt, is going back, he's like, okay, let me just go back. Depose the king of Judah at this point, who's this guy named Jehoahaz, installs his own king Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim later gets subjugated by Babylon, and then he rebels, so Babylon comes back, besieges him, takes him captive, puts this guy named Jehoiakim, we're getting real unique with our names, Jehoiakim in, and he rebels, and Babylon comes back and takes him, until finally this last king of Judah named Zedekiah, and he rebels one more time. And in the saddest thing in the Jewish nation up until this point, Babylon comes and besieges Jerusalem, and pretty much wipes it off the face of the earth. Takes all of the people from Judah, takes them all the way to Babylon and all of their land, and resettles them. And the reason we talk about this is because this is a key moment in our story. Because this moment is the saddest moment. The promise God made in the beginning is never coming true. It's over. It's done with. It's never going to happen. At least that's what it feels like if you're one of those Jews who's being taken into captivity in Babylon, right? You feel forsaken. You feel like everything has gone wrong. What happened? It's awful. It's terrible. God, how could, and if you look at it from our perspective, if we're reading the Bible story as God wants to restore humanity and he's going to use this nation, how is that ever going to happen at this point? How is humanity going to be restored through these people? But there's one thing that I didn't mention. There's these guys named prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Malachi, Zechariah, all of these different people that you're going to read in the Bible and be like, what is happening? Because they are talking to Judah and Israel. In the last days of their kingdom, in the last half of the kingdom, you have all these prophets who are like, listen guys, if you don't become a different people, if you don't turn from evil, don't become people of justice instead of people of injustice, if the nobles of Israel don't stop like oppressing people, you're going to get taken out. Because look at this. These Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, there's the Hittites up there. They're all bigger than you. If you don't want God, you don't have anything. Like you don't have any protection. Good luck. And that's what they're trying to say over and over and over again, these prophets. And when they finally say, hey, listen, it's not even a question at this point. It isn't a if, then. It's just straight up happening. You're going into captivity. It's happening. But there's still this weird inkling of hope. There's this hope that says you're going to get pulled into exile, and yet God is going to bring you back. He's going to restore you to your land. And so they wait in exile for 70 years. And guess what happens? This nation called Persia that's over here comes and takes Babylon under Cyrus the Great. And this guy, Cyrus, was like, he's a cool guy. He's like, I just want everybody to be themselves. I just want to be in charge of all of you, right? So he says, you can go back to your home. And they go back to their home. A few thousand of them go back to their home, somewhere in the realm of 50 to 60,000. They go back. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah talk about this. And it's really cool. It's really hopeful. Like this is that moment where you're like, okay, maybe it's all going to happen again. But the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are the most anticlimactic books you will ever read in your life. I'm not joking. Like they really are. You read through it and you expect there's going to be a good resolution. Like we're going to get to the end of this and it's going to be like we're going to be looking forward into a new world. But the whole time they come back, they rebuild the temple, they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but all of the people that come back are not people that are formed in the image of God. They are still worshiping other gods. They have married women from other nations. Not that those women are bad, but that the influence of those people was bad. They've done all of these different things. Nehemiah sets up all of these different religious reforms in the land. He goes back to Persia to see the king, comes back, all of it's undone. None of the people are following it. People aren't paying tithe, so the priests are like, well, we can't survive, so we're going to go back and work in the farms. All of this stuff happens, and so the moral decay of the people starts again. And literally, I'm not kidding you, that's kind of where it ends in the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah has these few times, at least 3 or 4 times, where he's just like, God, this is what I did. And he lays it all out. Bless me for it. I tried. Like, that's his attitude at that point. He's like, what else am I supposed to do with these people? And that's where the story ends. There's one more book called Esther, but it's the story of back over here in Persia. And it's the story of how the Jews get saved from a genocide. And so it's part of our story, but the narrative of the people of Israel as a whole in the land ends in the book of Nehemiah with this really anticlimactic, what's going to happen now? And the reason we go through all of this, and because we're not ending here. If we ended here, because I know I was going through the Old Testament. Well, it turns out we're not. We're going to extend this by 2 more weeks, and we're going to talk about 2 more things. Because the story, if we end it here, is one of the saddest endings you could end with. Of people who are in the place that they're supposed to be, but it's not at all what it should be. And it's sad, and it looks hopeless. That's where we end. And we have 400 years of silence, at least in our Bibles. 400 years of silence between that and the coming of Jesus. And in that time, it all just kind of goes the same way. They kind of get their independence for a little while, they get taken over, and then they get taken over by a Greek empire, and then Rome comes. That's what happens. And so it's just never what it should be. But I wanted to tell you guys this today, that I know for a lot of us, we sometimes feel like we're in that place with Israel, where everything in our life was going well, and it was going in a good direction, and it was everything that we wanted it to be. But then something happened, choices we made, or things that happened to us happened in our lives. Maybe it's a mix of both. And we kind of come to these places in our lives where we feel forsaken by God. We feel empty. We feel like my life isn't what I wanted it to. My dreams haven't come out the way I wanted to. My marriage hasn't come out the way I wanted to. My children maybe haven't come out the way I wanted to. All of this stuff has just not really happened the way I was hoping, right? I think a lot of us have moments like that in our life. And this ending of the story, I think, really resonates with, I think, a lot of our lives. Where everything is, it's okay, Like they're back in the land and they got their temple back and the walls are there, but there's just something missing. I think that resonates with a lot of us. There's something missing. There's something missing. And the reason I bring this up is because I think that the rest of the story, the trailer that I'm going to give you for the rest of the story is super exciting. And it's that's not the end. That the prophets point forward to this king who's going to come in the line of David. And he's going to be this guy who's going to restore the glory of Israel. People are going to flock to Israel all over again. He's going to be this king of justice. He's going to be this good, amazing, incredible king. And when he finally comes, then the prophecy or the call that God placed on Abraham will be fulfilled. They're pointing forward to this. They have to wait 400 years, but all of a sudden we have this guy who just shows up, kind of nonchalant. His name is Jesus. And what God does in this moment is he comes to be with us, Emmanuel, God with us. Because God has not forsaken his people. He's not forsaken you. I know that maybe your life feels like, well, it's okay, but there's something missing. It's not the end of your life. God still has plans for you. It isn't over. And what if I told you that God still wants to make you into the person that he always dreamed you would be? He loves you where you are right now, but he still wants to build you into that person. He always made you to me. Like he still wants to build your children who maybe aren't in the place that they should be right now. He still wants to build them into the people that they were made to be. He still wants those dreams in your life. Maybe it's a reframing of the dreams, but he still wants like what you were always built to desire. He still wants that to come true in your life. What if I told you that? That God has not forsaken you or left you, and that he's planning on coming into your life in some incredible ways. And yet for so long, we'll just kind of stay in our little like mediocre state, just kind of trying to get by. But I really think that God has plans for you. Plans to give you hope and a future. You know that verse? For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Guess where that's said? It's said in the context of, guess what? You're going into exile. But I have plans for you. God doesn't promise you the happy, like go lucky, nothing goes wrong life. He doesn't promise you that. He doesn't promise you a life without exile. Because we often get ourselves into those places in our lives where we're lost and alone. We don't know what to do with ourselves. But we have a God who has plans to prosper us, not to harm us, plans to give us hope and a future. Amen. Let's pray. God, I thank you so much for the God that you are. As we look at this story, I mean, it's such a sad story. It's a tragedy, really, because it's not what it was supposed to be. It's not the world that you had laid out for these people. You said to them, like, be faithful to me, surrender to me, and it will go well for you. And if you don't, it won't. And you lay it out clearly, and you've laid it out clearly for us. And yet we still choose to not trust you, and we still choose to be surrendered to all of our selfish desires and things because we don't see another way. And yet, God, I think that you're more powerful than we could ever imagine. And we can trust you in everything in our life. We don't have to be surrendered to all of the selfish parts of our life because we have you. And we know that in you we can find a new heart, a new life, a new opportunity to not be self-centered, but to be others-centered and to be people who love and change the world around us, God. We are an extension of that call in Genesis chapter 12. We're not Israelites by birth, but we are called into the same thing because of who you are. Thank you so much for being a God that in spite of all of our choices, the way we get ourselves into trouble, you are not a God who forsakes us or leaves us. And though we may suffer the consequences of our choices and suffer the consequences of the sin of this world, you have plans to prosper us and not to harm us. Plans to give us hope in the future. Thank you, Lord. In your name, amen.